Greetings, I am Herbert Erpaderp, and today I'm going to build this Rubicon SU-85 or SU-122 kit. This is a 28mm or 1/56 scale plastic kit, and at this point it's one of Rubicon's older kits, but my experience with Rubicon's models has always been very good, so I'm certain this is going to be a decent model. On the back of the box we find a couple of images with suggested base colours, an image of the included decal sheet, and a bunch of information on both the SU-85 and the SU-122. Inside the box you'll find 3 sprues, the first of which looks to be the same as for the T-34 kit. The sprues are neat and tidy, and all of the parts are intact and look pretty nice. The detail is fairly good, though it is definitely a wargaming kit, so it's not as detailed as you might expect from a display model. It's perfectly fine. An example of this is the tracks, which don't have correct tread detail. They're like this because they're a single piece. The lack of tread detail is a trade-off. Personally, I like having the tracks this way. Looks better than having potential gaps where the track parts get joined together, so I'm fine with that. Tracks can always be covered in mud if you don't like their detail, or lack thereof. Other than that, everything looks pretty good. I couldn't find any obvious defects or flaws, and the mold lines are pretty minor. They shouldn't need too much work to clean up. Like the rest of the earlier Rubicon kits, no crew figures are included, which doesn't really bother me much. I don't tend to use the crew figures anyway. What is included is this decal sheet. There's a good variety of markings you can use here, which is always nice. Having used Rubicon's decals before, I feel confident that these will be good to work with. And of course there are instructions. These are as good as Rubicon's instructions have always been, which is to say very good. They're well laid out and easy to follow, which is pretty much exactly what you want in an instruction set. Let's begin. The instructions say to start by assembling the tracks and lower hull, and that does make sense. This isn't too hard at all. I begin by installing the drive sprocket, which goes on this end of the hull. This part has a D-shaped keying, so the holes in both halves of the sprocket should line up. There is a tiny bit of play in the part, but that's fine. It shouldn't really affect anything. Then the idler wheel goes on in pretty much the same way with the same D-shaped keying and the same little bit of play. I try to make sure it's lined up as straight and neatly as it can be. I then add the inner halves of the road wheels. This has a keying on each wheel, so you could remove the bars between each wheel, though they are meant to go on as a set. We can then press that track assembly onto the axle pin parts on the lower hull. Try not to drop the parts. This goes together pretty easily, just apply a bit of pressure and that's about it. The space between the second and third road wheels is a little bit bigger than the rest, and you can see the bar between them quite obviously, so I just clip that off with my sprue cutters. Simple enough. It does look much better without that bar. The other bars are still there, but they shouldn't be too noticeable. Next, after having assembled the other set of tracks off camera, I can join both of the lower hull sides together. As you can see, there are a couple of poles that slot together. Nothing too tricky here. I then add the lower front plate, but because I'm a numpty, I didn't film it. Rest assured it was easy, and I'm sure you'll see the result later in the video. I did remember to film the rear plate and final drive cover part being glued into place. As you can see, it's pretty easy and looks fairly decent. Next, I decided I would add the upper hull. It is skipping forward in the instructions a bit, but I don't see this causing any issues. Nothing needs to be poked through from the inside of the hull or anything like that. There's a pole that slots into the lower hull and some tabs at the front to help locate the correct position. I did this because I wanted a bit more time to ponder on which version of the vehicle I wanted to build. Next, I added the upper rear plate. This more or less just drops right into the recess intended for it on the back of the hull. The fit is pretty good. There are some slight gaps all the way around this part, but it is Russian armour, so it would be stranger if there were no gaps. After a bit of umming and ahhing, I decided I would build the SU-85 for reasons, so I put together the appropriate gun assembly. This base part of the gun slides in through the back of the mantlet. I found it a little bit fiddly. There's a tab sticking up out from the top of this part that sort of got caught as I tried to slide it into place, but it's not hard once you figure out what's going on. The inner part has an almost T-shape to it which slots into the bottom of the main gun. There are better ways to join gun halves together, but this isn't too bad. I add some glue, slot the parts together, and apply pressure to minimise the gaps as much as I can. The result isn't perfect, but it's not bad either. I glue the gun part into place. There is a backing part you can use if you want to have a movable gun, but I don't, so I glue it solidly into place. I then add some glue at the base of the gun and slide the mantlet into place like so. There's a little recess on the inside of the mantlet that links in with the protrusion on the top of the gun that was interfering with the part being slotted in through the mantlet earlier. The fit is really good and looks quite nice. Then, the gun mantlet gets a little hat. I'm not sure what this part is called, but I would guess that it's to keep weather and debris out of the opening in the mantlet. And that's the gun assembly completed. It looks quite good. Not as derpy as the IS-122, but that's okay. Not every gun has to be a derp gun. Speaking of gun, I did have to drill out the end of the barrel because it was just flat. I didn't film it, but by now you should know what that looks like. I think the result is pretty good. I put the gun assembly aside to work on the casemate. There's a bit of red text in the instructions for this urging you to test fit before gluing, which is always great advice. So that's what I did, and we should always do that. Consider this a reminder. The test fit is successful, though I can see that I'm going to need to apply a bit of pressure, so I glue the part into place. Obviously you have to choose the correct casemate part because they're both quite different, particularly the opening for the gun. This part fits really nicely. Now it's time to make some external fuel drums. This is pretty easy. They're two simple parts that go together. You will need to pay attention to the numbers of the parts though. The parts for the left and right tanks are different. I would suggest building the tanks for one side and leaving the parts for the other side on the sprue until you need them. The tanks do look okay, but you'll probably end up with some seams that need to be cleaned up. I then glue these fuel tanks on. There's some small corner points that I'm assuming are intended to guide these tanks, and if they aren't, they work well enough for that purpose anyway. I work slowly and attach these one leg at a time. This is an attempt at being less messy with the glue. It's not that time consuming and the result is pretty good. These fuel tanks are of course an optional part. I've obviously added all 4, but you can add however many you want, though if the fuel tank is missing there is usually part of the mounting bracket left behind. I'm a bit too lazy to try and model that. The tanks look pretty good anyway. Now it's time for more detail. First, this toolbox on the right rear. This is fairly simple. The 2 latch bits should be facing out away from the hull and the 3 hinge bits should face inwards. I couldn't get my fat fingers under the fuel drums, so I used my knife to manipulate the part into place. But that's fine, it's still easy to get into place. Next I add this pile of spare track links up next to the casemate. This is super easy to place though there's no keying, so you do get a little bit of leeway as to where they go. I like these, they should break up the green a bit and add some interest when I paint this. Then I add another toolbox to the vehicle's front left. Like the rear one, this is easy. This one is a little bit longer than the other toolbox though, so do be sure that you're using the correct parts. After that, it's time to assemble the headlamp. This comes as 2 parts. There is keying here so you get these parts put together correctly, which is easy, though it does seem as though the lens part on the front sits a little bit low. Oh well, it looks okay anyway. Once it's together, it's pretty easy to glue into place. There's a notch for it to mount into at the front left here. I give it a bit of a nudge until it's in place. Looks good. Now it's time to move on to the hatches. The one on top is simple, it more or less just drops into place. You'll have to cut it in half if you want to model it open, but no crew figures are included anyway and there's no internal detail, so I think it looks better closed. Then I install the driver's hatch on the front plate. There is a little bit of play in this, but it does fit nicely enough. There should be a little bit of a gap around this, it is a hatch after all. On a Russian vehicle no less. I then move on to the 2-part hatch at the back of the casemate. Is this where the commander sits, or is it for the loader, or just a generic hatch for everybody? I don't know. This is only slightly more tricky to attach than the other 2. Just be careful and try not to drop the small part in through the hole, especially if it's got glue on it. Looks pretty decent, and you could easily model this open if you wanted. Then it's time to add the spare track links at the front of the hull. I used the gun assembly to make sure that I wasn't installing the spare track links too high. It would be a pain in the balls to have this interfere with the installation of the main gun. I could have also installed the main gun before the spare track links, but I didn't. Once I'm sure they will fit nicely, I glue the spare track links into place. These are of course optional, but in my opinion they're a pretty iconic part of how a T-34 based vehicle looks, so I really like including them. They also help to add interest and break up the green on a vehicle like this, which will be almost entirely green. And then why not glue the main gun into place? Obviously we don't want to then immediately knock it out of place. The fit here is pretty good. I apply a little pressure to minimize what tiny gaps were there, and it's done. One last part I almost forgot is this, I'm assuming, antenna mount. This tiny part mounts into this notch here on the right side of the casemate, just near this raised rectangle bit with the vision device on top of it. Is that the commander's position? I don't think so. Either way, the antenna mount goes here very easily, and that's the SU-85 in 28mm by Rubicon models done. Unfortunately, my rotating display thing has broken, so we'll do things the old non-moving way. I don't have another SU-85 with which to compare this model, but I do believe it would stand up to any other offerings in this scale very well. I rather like it. It's neat, well enough detailed, and it should look pretty great when it's painted. You can tell it's an SU-85, though some might confuse it with an SU-100, and you could probably use it as a proxy easily enough. Only the rivet countery types are likely to complain about that, and I'm not likely to play a game of bolt action against them, so it's not really a concern. As far as I know, nobody makes a plastic SU-100 in this scale, so proxying with this SU-85 is probably a quite good option, unless you want to buy the resin model. Personally, I don't. I actually had a little bit of trouble deciding between the SU-85 and the SU-122, and I might actually buy another one of these just to build the 122. I don't know if it's that useful in bolt action at all, but it sure is interesting to look at, and I could probably have some HE firing fun with it. I think this is a pretty decent kit. It was fun to build and didn't take a whole lot of time. The instructions were simple and easily followed, and I do appreciate the reminders to test fit things. We all forget sometimes. The result is a pretty decent representation of an SU-85, and I think the 122 would be just as good a representation of that vehicle. Of course, it's not the newest Rubicon kit, and they are continuously working and improving their models, including pre-existing kits, so we may see a reworked version of this coming out at some point. I do really like that dedication to improvement, but for now, this is decent enough. I would say the only problem I have with it is the tracks and their lack of detail, but I don't consider that to be a huge issue, and it's something I expected having seen and built Rubicon's T-34s. There's always ways to hide it if it bugs you anyway. So, what do you think? Have you built this kit? Do you field SU-85s in your Soviet forces? Let me know in the comments section below. And of course, if you have any other questions or comments, feel free to leave those in the comments section too. And if you haven't already, why not sub here on YouTube, follow me on social media, or watch me stream on Twitch. And if you really like what I do, please consider supporting over on Patreon, or perhaps by purchasing a shirt or mug from my merch store. Links to all of those things are in the description below, and as always, I shall return soon, so until then, be excellent to each other and thanks for watching. Farewell.